At dawn on June 20th, Tobruk still contained about 33,000 Allied troops. Its perimeter stretched across the Libyan desert behind mines, wire, guns, and concrete posts. By the following morning, most of that garrison was heading into captivity. The fortress had survived an 8-month siege during 1941. Its name had become shorthand for stubborn resistance against Erwin Rommel. Yet the second battle did not resemble the first siege. This time, Tobruk collapsed after roughly 1 day of concentrated attack. That result cannot be explained by cowardice or one disastrous order. The system protecting the fortress had already begun breaking before the first dive bombers arrived. The visible disaster started in the southeastern sector shortly before sunrise. German and Italian aircraft struck artillery positions, communications, and defensive strongpoints. Engineers then opened passages through mines protecting the perimeter. German infantry pushed into the breach behind a heavy concentration of fire. Armored formations followed before the defenders could seal the opening. Within hours, the attack had moved beyond the outer positions. That speed created the first mystery. Tobruk possessed men, artillery, tanks, ammunition, fuel, and extensive fortifications. It was not an empty outpost surprised by a patrol. The garrison included the 2nd South African Infantry Division. It also contained British Guards, Indian infantry, artillery, and an army tank brigade. On paper, these forces appeared capable of mounting a serious defense, but paper strength concealed a dangerous arrangement. Many defenders occupied sectors far from the German breakthrough. Some units never received a clear opportunity to engage the main assault. The fortress commander, Major General Hendrik Klopper, had received the appointment only days earlier. He inherited formations drawn from different armies and commands. They had not trained together as one fortress garrison. More importantly, their mission had remained uncertain. Earlier plans treated Tobruk as part of a wider defensive system. It was not consistently prepared for another prolonged independent siege. The distinction mattered. A fortress expected to hold alone requires protected communications and rehearsed counterattacks. It needs secure reserves, prepared fallback positions, and destruction plans understood by every unit. Tobruk had impressive quantities of supplies. It lacked the same depth of preparation in its defensive system. Sections of the old perimeter had deteriorated since the famous siege. Mines and wire had been removed for use elsewhere. Some defensive works had not been restored to their former condition. The southeastern sector offered Rommel the opening his reconnaissance needed. There was another problem beyond the wire. The British 8th Army had just suffered defeat around Gazala. Its formations were withdrawing eastward while Tobruk became isolated. On June 17th, Axis forces cut the coastal road east of the port. The fortress was no longer a secure anchor connected to a functioning field army. It had become a pocket. Even then, collapse was not inevitable. The garrison still possessed a mobile reserve intended to counter a penetration. If that reserve struck early and coherently, the breach might be contained. But the Axis attack compressed decisions faster than information could travel. Telephone lines failed or became overloaded. Reports arrived late, incomplete, or already overtaken by German movement. The counterattack was assembled under growing confusion. Its tanks and infantry did not enter battle as one concentrated force. They met German armor that had already gained room inside the perimeter. By afternoon, Axis forces had reached Tobruk's airfield. Soon they were approaching the harbor and dividing the defensive system. The outer wall had not merely been pierced. The fortress had lost its internal freedom of movement. That was the first irreversible break, yet the surrender still lay hours away, behind an even more destructive failure. The next failure began with a mistaken picture of the attack itself. Some headquarters initially treated the southeastern assault as a possible diversion. Rommel had encouraged that interpretation by demonstrating elsewhere around the perimeter. His real concentration was already facing the weakest operational seam. The Indian battalions there held an exposed section of the old defenses. Behind them, the ground offered routes toward the airfield and harbor. At about 5:30, Axis aircraft began striking the chosen sector. Dive bombers suppressed gun positions while artillery covered engineers moving toward the obstacles. Dust and smoke reduced the defenders' ability to identify the main effort. The bombardment was not remarkable merely because it was heavy. Its timing joined aircraft, engineers, infantry, artillery, and armor into one sequence. Each element removed an obstacle for the next. Engineers crossed the anti-tank ditch and prepared passages for vehicles. Infantry cleared or isolated nearby strongpoints. Tanks then entered before the garrison could rebuild a continuous defensive line. The perimeter had been designed to make this process slow and expensive, but neglected obstacles shortened the time required to create a usable opening. The fortress lost the delay upon which every later response depended. Several defensive posts continued, fighting after Axis troops passed them. Their resistance remained tactically important but operationally isolated. They could kill attackers without closing the widening corridor behind them. This revealed a cruel difference between holding ground and preserving a system. Individual positions could remain undefeated while the fortress around them collapsed. Courage at one post could not restore communications across the entire perimeter. Klopper ordered the mobile reserve toward the penetration. The force included infantry tanks from the 32nd Army Tank Brigade. These were heavily protected machines, but many were slow and already worn by desert operations. The counterattack needed precise information about the breach. Instead, commanders received an incomplete picture of German strength and direction. Orders passed through a network being damaged as the battle moved inward. The tanks did not strike as one fresh armored fist. Groups entered at different times and met concentrated German anti-tank fire. Axis armor also had room to maneuver beyond the breached perimeter. The reserve, therefore, paid for every earlier delay. It fought after the enemy had transformed a narrow opening into defended space. Its mission changed from sealing a gap to retaking ground under hostile observation. By midday, the planned counterstroke had failed to restore the perimeter. The garrison's main instrument for reversing the battle was being broken apart. That was the first major payoff in Tobruk's collapse. The fortress had not failed because it lacked a reserve. It failed because the reserve entered after the defensive system had lost control of the breach. Possession of tanks was less important than the sequence governing their use. Outside Tobruk, British commanders attempted to relieve the pressure. A force was ordered toward the area from the southeast. German covering troops blocked that effort before it could threaten the assault. The garrison could therefore expect no immediate rescue. Its aircraft support was also severely limited. The Desert Air Force had withdrawn to more distant bases during the retreat from Gazala. Rommel could concentrate air power over a small battlefield. The defenders could not impose an equivalent cost on his assembly and movement. The imbalance accelerated every stage of the penetration. By late afternoon, German forces had taken the airfield. Shortly afterward, their leading elements reached the port area. Tobruk was now divided between units facing different directions with shrinking communications. Yet thousands of defenders remained outside the captured eastern zone. Many still held weapons, ammunition, and intact positions. A coordinated withdrawal might have saved part of the garrison. That option depended upon vehicles, fuel, routes, and orders arriving before darkness. Inside headquarters, however, reports now described German armor near the town and harbor. Demolition parties were preparing to destroy the supplies that an escape would require. The same stores that made Tobruk appear capable of a siege were becoming liabilities once destroyed. They could not support resistance or movement. If left intact, they would strengthen Rommel's next advance. The fortress had reached a decision with no safe branch, but one final assumption still shaped Klopper's response. He believed the field army might yet fight its way back toward Tobruk. The expected relief force existed more clearly in orders than on the battlefield. 7th Armored Division was directed northward from the Egyptian frontier toward Sidi Rezeg. Its movement offered Klopper a reason to postpone an immediate breakout, but the formation outside Tobruk was no longer the force its name suggested. Weeks of fighting had reduced its strength and scattered its surviving elements. It also faced German troops positioned specifically to protect the siege. The 90th Light Division guarded Rommel's eastern flank. It blocked routes that a relief column would need to cross. No British force came close enough to disrupt the main assault. This was not simply a failure at Tobruk. The defeat at Gazala had damaged the entire command system surrounding the fortress. Senior commanders were still issuing missions based on strength that no longer existed. Before the retreat, British planning had rejected another long siege. Tobruk was supposed to support a wider position, not become an isolated battlefield. That assumption shaped maintenance, supply arrangements, and the placement of forces. Then the strategic decision changed. The port was ordered to hold when the surrounding army was already withdrawing. A mission designed for one system was imposed upon another. The contradiction reached Klopper only days before the attack. He had to defend a large perimeter while preparing against encirclement. He also had to believe that forces outside might restore contact. This created the second major reversal. Tobruk's abundant supplies did not prove that the fortress was prepared. They proved that it had served as a logistical base for the Gazala position. Food, ammunition, fuel, and vehicles filled the area. Their location did not automatically place them where defenders needed them. Nor did their existence create trained teams, reliable signals, or rehearsed plans. By the evening of June 20th, time had become more valuable than supplies. German armor controlled the airfield and threatened the harbor. The remaining defenders were compressed into the western part of the perimeter. Some officers considered breaking out during darkness. A breakout offered no guarantee of survival. It required thousands of men to cross enemy-held ground and open desert. The garrison contained many support personnel without infantry training. Transport was unevenly distributed, and German columns guarded the eastern approaches. Wounded men and troops holding distant posts complicated any general movement, yet delay made every problem worse. Vehicles could be disabled or captured. Fuel stocks were already being prepared for demolition. Routes that remained open at dusk might be closed before midnight. A successful escape also needed one command decision reaching every formation. That network no longer functioned reliably. Some units remained unaware of decisions made only a few miles away. Klopper's headquarters shifted as Axis troops entered the town. Signals became fragmented between the fortress, subordinate brigades, and 8th Army. The commander could neither see the entire battle nor reliably direct it. Reports from outside offered little certainty. The relief movement had not broken the Axis cordon, but the possibility of assistance had not disappeared from Klopper's calculations. Holding for rescue and escaping immediately required opposite preparations. One preserved positions and supplies, the other concentrated transport and opened routes before the enemy sealed them. Tobruk attempted neither option with full commitment. It continued resisting, while the opportunity for organized withdrawal narrowed. The fortress was trapped between an outdated mission and a disappearing alternative. As darkness arrived, demolitions began around fuel, ammunition, workshops, and harbor facilities. Smoke rose over installations that had supported the 8th Army. The destruction confirmed that continued resistance could not last indefinitely. It also reduced the mobility required for a breakout. Every successful demolition denied supplies to Rommel. The same explosion could deny them to Allied troops seeking escape. The garrison had entered a destructive feedback loop. Fear of capture encouraged demolition. Demolition reduced the ability to resist or withdraw. By nightfall, the question was no longer whether Tobruk could restore its perimeter. The question was whether any coherent force could still leave. Then German armor began gathering west of the town, near the remaining South African positions. The German concentration west of the town made a breakout appear even more dangerous. Klopper feared that exposed columns would meet armor before reaching the open desert. By then, no complete escape plan could be distributed and rehearsed before dawn. The opportunity had not vanished at one exact moment. It had been consumed in pieces by delay, lost communications, damaged transport, and uncertainty. Each hour removed another condition required for organized movement. Some small groups still escaped independently. Their success showed that the Axis ring was not physically solid everywhere. It did not prove that tens of thousands could pass through unnoticed. A mass breakout would create dust, noise, headlights, and traffic congestion. Many soldiers lacked vehicles or reliable knowledge of minefield lanes. German aircraft could attack the columns after sunrise. Klopper therefore faced choices that had all deteriorated beyond their original value. Remain in place, and the western sector might be crushed. Break out, and much of the garrison could be scattered or destroyed. The final night became a contest between resistance and demolition. Engineers tried to destroy fuel, ammunition, workshops, and harbor facilities. Other troops prepared positions for an attack expected at first light. The destruction was incomplete. There was too much material and too little coordinated time. Some charges failed, while other stores could not be reached safely. This mattered beyond the surrender. Tobruk had accumulated supplies for a field army. What survived would help Rommel reduce the distance between his troops and their logistical base. At headquarters, the situation reports continued worsening. The mobile reserve was no longer capable of restoring the battle. The harbor area and important water installations had been lost or threatened. Communications with several formations remained uncertain. The garrison no longer operated as one force. It had become separated groups with radically different views of the battlefield. Troops near the town had seen German armor and burning depots. Units on remote sections of the perimeter had encountered little direct pressure. For them, an order to surrender could appear disconnected from visible reality. This difference later created accusations that some defenders had yielded without fighting. The accusation confused local experience with operational control. A battalion could remain intact while the command linking it to every other battalion had collapsed. Shortly after dawn on June 21st, Klopper concluded that organized resistance could not continue. He sent officers to seek terms from the Axis command. Rommel did not offer a negotiated evacuation or limited capitulation. At about 20 minutes before 10, Klopper formally surrendered. The decision placed most of the garrison in Axis hands. It did not instantly end fighting across the entire perimeter. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Gurkha Rifles, remained isolated in the eastern defenses. The 2nd Battalion, Cameron Highlanders, also received confused or delayed information. Their positions had not been overrun during the main penetration, when surrender messages reached these troops. Disbelief followed. Some attempted to continue resistance or find routes through the surrounding forces. Small parties moved across the desert toward British lines. Most could not escape the expanding Axis occupation. The Camerons held out beyond the general capitulation before finally laying down their arms. Their experience exposed the central fact of Tobruk's defeat. The fortress did not collapse because every defensive position was destroyed. It collapsed because the positions could no longer produce a common military action. Command had ceased to convert surviving strength into resistance. Approximately 33,000 Allied personnel became prisoners. Among them were more than 10,000 South Africans. The scale made Tobruk one of Britain's largest capitulations of the war, but the immediate Axis gain was not measured only in prisoners. Tanks, vehicles, guns, fuel, food, and ammunition remained inside the captured base. The port itself was available for restoration and use. Rommel had eliminated an obstacle and acquired resources for continued pursuit. The Allied failure therefore strengthened the enemy. At the exact moment, 8th Army was retreating. Tobruk's fall was about to spread far beyond its perimeter. Tobruk's captured stores gave Rommel something his army desperately needed. Fuel and vehicles could be used immediately during the pursuit into Egypt. Food and ammunition reduced the pressure on supply columns stretching back across Libya. The exact totals vary between wartime reports and later accounts. What matters is that substantial quantities survived the demolitions. Axis records described large stocks of petrol, ammunition, weapons, tanks, and transport. The harbor was another prize. A functioning port closer to Egypt promised to shorten part of the supply journey. Engineers and naval personnel began restoring its usefulness soon after capture. This transformed Tobruk from an Allied shield into an Axis stepping stone. The fortress had not merely failed to stop the enemy. Its remaining resources helped carry that enemy toward the next defensive line. Rommel moved east on June 22nd. His decision extended the consequences of Tobruk before the British could reorganize. The pursuit reached positions around Mersa Matruh within days. For German leaders, the victory appeared to confirm Rommel's judgment. Hitler promoted him to field marshal. At 49, he became the German army's youngest officer holding that rank. The promotion captured the emotional force of the moment. A famous fortress had fallen after a remarkably short assault. Tens of thousands of prisoners and enormous quantities of equipment stood behind the headlines. In Washington, Winston Churchill received news of the disaster while meeting President Roosevelt. The surrender struck Britain after months of setbacks in Asia and the Mediterranean. Its political impact exceeded the duration of the battle. Yet the operational meaning remained more complicated. Rommel had won supplies, momentum, and freedom to continue east. He had not repaired the structural weakness of Axis logistics in North Africa. Every mile toward Egypt increased the distance from established ports and workshops. Captured British vehicles required fuel, maintenance, tires, and spare parts. A sudden windfall could sustain movement without creating a durable supply system. This was the next reversal. The Fall of Tobruk strengthened the Axis advance. It also encouraged a decision that would stretch Axis resources farther than before. German and Italian plans had included an assault on Malta. The island threatened shipping, carrying supplies across the Mediterranean. Air and naval forces based there could attack the routes supporting Rommel. After Tobruk, the prospect of reaching Alexandria and the Suez Canal appeared more urgent. Rommel pressed for an immediate advance into Egypt. The planned invasion of Malta was postponed. That strategic choice cannot be blamed on the fortress alone. It reflected competing priorities among German and Italian commanders. It also reflected the intoxicating evidence of British disorganization. The Eighth Army was retreating. Tobruk had fallen. Captured fuel sat ready for use. Together, those facts suggested that another rapid blow might finish the campaign. They did not show how long the captured supplies would last, nor did they guarantee another weakly prepared defensive system ahead. At Mersa Matruh, British forces again withdrew under pressure. Confusion and poor coordination continued to damage their response. Axis columns pushed across the Egyptian frontier toward El Alamein, but the battlefield was changing. The British supply line shortened as the army moved toward Alexandria. Axis transport had to cover greater distances over damaged roads and desert tracks. The Desert Air Force also operated closer to its bases. British commanders could concentrate surviving formations in a narrower position. Geography began removing the space Rommel had used for wide southern maneuvers. Tobruk, therefore, produced two opposing consequences. It gave the Axis the means and confidence to continue. That continuation carried them toward conditions where speed could no longer solve every problem. The fortress had fallen through a chain of systemic failures. Now the victor risked building a new chain around captured momentum. At El Alamein, less than 2 weeks later, that momentum would meet its first hard limit. On July 1st, Rommel attacked the El Alamein position with an exhausted army. Only 10 days had passed since Tobruk surrendered. The pursuit had covered hundreds of miles without a true operational pause. Captured fuel had enabled that movement. Captured vehicles had carried men and supplies eastward. Neither could replace the formations worn down since Gazala. Axis armored strength had fallen sharply during the campaign. Mechanical failures removed vehicles even when enemy fire did not. Infantry units were also depleted after weeks of continuous fighting. Rommel still expected British disorganization to create another rapid victory. That expectation had worked at Tobruk. It now met a defensive position with fundamentally different geometry. The Mediterranean protected the northern flank. The Qattara Depression restricted large armored movement in the south. The British line could not be bypassed through unlimited open desert. This forced the Axis attack into a narrower area. British artillery and aircraft could concentrate against fewer approaches. The defenders also operated close to Egyptian railways, depots, and airfields. The logistical balance had reversed. Every British retreat shortened the distance to Alexandria and Cairo. Every Axis advance lengthened the route from Tripoli, Benghazi, and Tobruk. Even supplies unloaded at Tobruk faced a long journey to the front. Trucks consumed fuel while transporting fuel. Breakdowns and air attacks reduced what finally reached combat units. The first Axis attacks failed to break the Alamein position. Unexpected resistance disrupted Rommel's schedule. His forces could no longer convert surprise into rapid operational movement. British and Commonwealth troops then launched counterattacks of their own. The fighting continued through July across ridges, defensive boxes, and minefields. Neither side achieved a clean destruction of the other. But the strategic result was clear. The Axis advance toward Alexandria had stopped. The supplies captured at Tobruk had purchased distance, not decision. This outcome changes how the fortress victory should be understood. Tobruk did not directly cause Rommel's later defeat. It created an opportunity whose value depended on the choice made afterward. One option was to pause, reorganize, and improve the supply system. Another was to exploit British disorder before it disappeared. Rommel chose speed because delay allowed the Eighth Army to recover. The reasoning was not irrational. A retreating enemy can become stronger if allowed to reach prepared positions. The mistake was treating captured momentum as evidence of sustainable strength. That distinction mirrors the Allied error before Tobruk. British commanders treated the presence of men and supplies as evidence of defensive readiness. Rommel treated captured supplies and retreating enemies as evidence that Egypt was within reach. In both cases, visible assets concealed failing systems. The Tobruk garrison possessed resources without coordinated preparation. The Axis army possessed momentum without dependable logistical depth. The battle therefore produced two collapses operating at different speeds. The Allied collapse happened inside one day. The limitation of the Axis advance emerged over the following weeks. By late July, Rommel's army was holding rather than pursuing. The British had suffered heavily, but they retained the Elamian line. Time now worked against the Axis. Men, tanks, and aircraft were reaching Egypt through Allied global supply networks. Axis reinforcements still had to cross the Mediterranean and travel across North Africa. Malta remained available to threaten those routes. The decision to postpone its invasion now carried greater weight. The fortress victory had encouraged a pursuit that failed to secure Egypt. It had also diverted attention from a threat to the Axis supply system. Tobruk's captured stores were being consumed. The machinery required to replace them remained vulnerable. What looked like a permanent strategic transformation was becoming a temporary advantage. Meanwhile, Britain demanded an explanation for the surrender. The question quickly narrowed toward the actions of one fortress commander. The surviving evidence pointed toward a much larger chain of responsibility. The search for responsibility began while many Tobruk officers remained prisoners. Public anger demanded a clear explanation for a fortress lost in one day. A single commander offered the simplest answer. Klopper had signed the surrender. His name therefore became inseparable from the disaster. But signing the final order was not the same as creating every condition behind it. A court of inquiry examined the fall later in 1942. Klopper could not appear because he remained in Axis captivity. The inquiry had to reconstruct decisions from available records and other witnesses. Its findings did not support placing the entire defeat upon him. Responsibility extended upward through the British command structure. The preparation and mission of Tobruk had been shaped long before Klopper faced Rommel's assault. The first failure was strategic ambiguity. Senior commanders had previously decided against repeating the long siege of 1941. That choice discouraged the full restoration of Tobruk as an independent fortress. Then the operational situation collapsed at Gazala. Tobruk was suddenly ordered to hold despite the retreat outside its perimeter. The new mission arrived without the time required to rebuild the old defensive system. The second failure was divided authority. Klopper commanded formations from several national and organizational backgrounds. He had inherited them rather than trained them as one integrated garrison. Their communications, reserve plans, and local procedures lacked full coordination. That weakness did not automatically make defeat certain. It made rapid recovery from surprise much harder. The third failure was a false estimate of the field army. Higher command expected 8th Army to preserve options near Tobruk. In reality, its formations were exhausted, depleted. And moving toward the frontier, orders still imagined simultaneous tasks. The army was expected to protect Egypt, prepare a counterstroke, and influence Tobruk. It no longer possessed the strength to perform all three effectively. The fourth failure was physical deterioration. Mines and wire had been removed from parts of the perimeter. Defensive works and anti-tank obstacles were not ready for the concentrated attack they received. These defects mattered because Rommel found the correct sector. His engineers did not have to overcome the fortress at its historical best. They attacked a reputation supported by weakened physical defenses. Klopper still made consequential decisions. The reserve counterattack lacked the speed and concentration required. The breakout option was considered too late for confident execution. His headquarters also struggled to distribute clear orders across the garrison. Those are legitimate areas for scrutiny. They do not erase the conditions imposed by decisions above his command. The inquiry's conclusions remained restricted during the war. That secrecy protected sensitive arguments and senior relationships. It also allowed public suspicion toward Klopper and South African troops to continue. South African Prime Minister Jan Smuts later stated that no blame rested on those troops. The controversy nevertheless survived because the visible evidence was emotionally powerful. Thousands had surrendered from positions that sometimes remained intact. That image concealed what the investigation had to reconstruct. A fortress is not simply the total number of armed men inside a boundary. It is a system that turns those men into coordinated resistance. At Tobruk, the system lost its outer barrier first. Then it lost its reserve, communications, internal movement, and reliable expectation of relief. The surviving battalions became disconnected pieces rather than a unified garrison. By the time Klopper surrendered, he commanded strength that could not be concentrated. Some units could still fight locally. They could not restore the harbor, airfield, mobile reserve, or command network. The disaster, therefore, cannot be reduced to one weak decision at dawn. It was a chain in which every earlier failure narrowed the final choice. The last order ended the battle, but it did not begin the collapse. One comparison makes that chain even clearer. Tobruk had faced Rommel before and survived for months. The difference between 1941 and 1942 was not the name of the fortress. In 1941, Tobruk was encircled after a deliberate Allied withdrawal into the fortress. The defenders understood that isolation was central to their mission. They prepared to resist without immediate support from a field army. Major General Leslie Morshead imposed an aggressive defensive method. His troops would not wait passively behind concrete posts. Night patrols and raids contested the ground outside the perimeter. That activity served several purposes. It disrupted Axis reconnaissance and made preparations harder to conceal. It also taught defenders the terrain beyond their own wire. The outer position formed only the first layer. A second defensive line stood farther inside the perimeter. Additional positions protected approaches toward the town and harbor. Reserves were held for counterattacks. Artillery, infantry, anti-tank weapons, and armor practiced supporting one another. A penetration was expected to trigger a coordinated response rather than immediate paralysis. The system was tested in April. German tanks crossed part of the perimeter during a major assault. Australian infantry remained concealed while armor passed some positions. They then attacked the supporting German infantry. British tanks and artillery engaged the penetration from deeper positions. The attacking force could not turn its entry into control of the fortress. The difference was not an absence of danger. Tobruk endured air raids, shelling, shortages, sickness, and heavy losses. Its defenders were spread across a perimeter roughly 45 kilometers long. The defense succeeded because each problem had a prepared relationship with the others. Outer posts provided warning. Depth slowed penetrations. Reserves attacked before the enemy established internal freedom of movement. The Royal Navy supplied the garrison by sea. Ships brought food, ammunition, reinforcements, and replacement equipment. They also removed wounded personnel and rotated formations despite Axis air attacks. This maritime route prevented encirclement from becoming complete isolation. The defenders could lose every land road and still receive material. Their endurance rested upon an active logistical system, not stored supplies alone. By June 1942, the physical location remained the same. The system surrounding it had changed. The garrison had not been organized around another 8-month siege. Some mines and wire had been transferred to the Gazala defenses. The inner defensive structure was not maintained to the previous standard. The new commander inherited little time to correct those weaknesses. Patrolling and reconnaissance also failed to provide equivalent control of the approaches. Rommel shifted formations toward the southeastern sector during the final preparation. The concentration achieved the surprise required for a rapid breach in 1941. A penetration met depth and a prepared counterstroke. In 1942, the breach expanded before reserves could act coherently. The Axis reached the airfield and harbor on the first day. Sea access offered less protection once the harbor itself was threatened. The wider retreat had also reduced air support and naval freedom around Tobruk. The fortress could not repeat its earlier logistical endurance. The comparison removes one comforting explanation. Tobruk was not naturally impregnable in 1941, nor was it naturally indefensible 1 year later. Fortifications only created time. Reconnaissance, reserves, communications, and command had to use that time. When those functions weakened, concrete could become scenery around disconnected troops. Rommel also learned from the first siege. Instead of settling into another long encirclement, he concentrated force against a chosen sector. Aircraft, artillery, engineers, infantry, and tanks acted in rapid succession. The attackers entered the second battle with a system designed to accelerate collapse. The defenders entered with a famous name and an unfinished transformation. The result was decided by the interaction between those systems. This explains why morale alone cannot account for the outcome. The garrison of 1942 included units that fought after the formal surrender. Their willingness did not rebuild the missing defensive architecture. The decisive contrast was preparation for isolation. In the first siege, isolation was the starting condition. In the second, isolation arrived as an emergency after the wider army had already failed. That emergency had roots stretching back through the Battle of Gazala. To understand Tobruk's final day, the collapse must be traced to decisions made weeks earlier. The road to Tobruk began on May 26 at the Gazala line. British and Commonwealth forces occupied fortified brigade boxes behind extensive minefields. Mobile armor was expected to destroy any enemy trapped between them. On maps, the design combined fixed defense with armored counterattack. In practice, the boxes stood far apart. They could resist locally without forming one continuous line. The armored formations behind them were also dispersed. Command arrangements divided tanks, infantry, and artillery across several headquarters. Concentration required coordination that the Eighth Army repeatedly failed to achieve. Rommel sent demonstrations against the northern positions. His main mobile force swept around Bir Hakeim at the southern end. The maneuver placed Axis armor behind much of the Gazala line. The operation initially created severe danger for Rommel. His formations became separated from their normal supply route. British minefields restricted movement while fuel and ammunition declined. Axis forces concentrated inside an area later called the Cauldron. They began clearing passages westward through the minefields. For several days, the British possessed an opportunity to crush the exposed concentration. That opportunity was not invisible. Reconnaissance and battlefield reports showed that Rommel faced serious supply problems. The Eighth Army also retained numerical advantages in tanks, but British attacks arrived in fragments. Armored brigades fought separately and entered different sectors at different times. German tanks, artillery, and anti-tank guns met them as coordinated groups. The fortified boxes created a similar problem. Some held with remarkable determination. Their resistance could delay Axis movement but could not direct the wider battle. The Free French position at Bir Hakeim resisted until June 10th. The 150th Brigade Box also forced Rommel to commit time and strength. Those local successes created opportunities that higher command failed to combine. Operation Aberdeen was intended to destroy the Cauldron on June 5th. Its infantry, tanks, and artillery did not maintain the required coordination. Axis defensive fire stopped the attack and inflicted heavy losses. The result changed the balance. Rommel had survived his moment of greatest vulnerability. He could now attack British formations after they had spent strength in failed counterstrokes. British armor continued entering battle piecemeal. By mid-June, its effective strength had fallen dramatically. The mobile force meant to protect the defensive boxes could no longer perform that mission once the armor weakened. The Gazala system lost its connecting mechanism. Fixed positions became islands. Withdrawal orders then moved through a command structure already under severe pressure. Some formations escaped eastward. Others had to break through Axis routes or abandon equipment. Traffic, demolitions, and conflicting movements spread confusion along the coastal road. Tobruk received retreating troops and headquarters during this upheaval. The port became crowded with units that had not arrived as a prepared fortress garrison. The wider defeat was physically entering the perimeter. This was the chain that the final assault completed. Dispersed armor failed to destroy Rommel in the Cauldron. The surviving Axis force reduced the boxes and forced a retreat. The retreat isolated Tobruk. Tobruk then received an improvised mission without sufficient preparation. Rommel attacked before that mission could become a functioning defense. No single stage guaranteed the next. A better counterattack at Gazala might have changed the campaign. An earlier evacuation could have preserved the Tobruk garrison. A restored perimeter or faster reserve response might have delayed the breach. A coordinated night breakout might have saved additional troops. At each stage, however, the available choices became worse. That is what made the disaster systemic. The failure of one component increased pressure upon every remaining component. Each damaged response made the next decision more urgent and less informed. By dawn on June 21st, Klopper confronted the accumulated result. He did not possess the options available at Gazala 3 weeks earlier. Those options had already been consumed by the chain of defeat. The final question is therefore not why one commander surrendered. It is when the Allied system crossed the point from recoverable failure to irreversible collapse. The irreversible point came after the reserve failed to close the Southeastern breach. Until then, the garrison still possessed a mechanism for restoring the perimeter. Afterward, Axis armor could move faster inside Tobruk than headquarters could react. The capture of the airfield confirmed that the penetration had become operational. The arrival of German forces near the harbor divided the defensive system. At that stage, local resistance could delay occupation but not reunite the fortress. This identifies the answer hidden inside the title. Tobruk was not broken by the first bomb or the final surrender. It broke when its surviving strength could no longer be converted into coordinated action. Several failures had to combine before that happened. The Gazala defeat removed the field army that protected Tobruk from isolation. The late decision to hold imposed a mission for which the fortress was not prepared. Neglected obstacles reduced the warning provided by the perimeter. Weak integration delayed the counterattack. Damaged communications prevented headquarters from maintaining a common picture. Limited air support allowed Rommel to concentrate over the decisive sector. Axis covering forces blocked the expected relief movement. Uncertainty then consumed the hours required for a breakout. Each failure multiplied the next. A stronger perimeter would have given the reserve more time. A faster reserve could have preserved internal movement. Reliable communications might have concentrated surviving formations. A clear withdrawal plan might have saved troops before demolition destroyed their mobility. None of those safeguards remained fully effective when required. That is why the number of defenders can mislead. Approximately 33,000 people inside Tobruk did not equal 33,000 available combat troops. Many belonged to support services or units facing sectors far from the breach. Even the combat formations could not all engage one target. Distance, orders, transport, and communications determined where their strength existed. The Axis concentrated force while the garrison experienced its strength as separated fragments. The same principle applies to the stores. Fuel in a depot is not mobility unless vehicles can reach it. Ammunition is not firepower unless guns receive it and commanders direct their fire. Fortifications are not defense unless troops can observe, reinforce, and counterattack through them. Tobruk possessed the visible objects associated with military power. The relationships between those objects had failed. Rommel's victory was therefore both tactical and systemic. His assault struck one physical sector. Its speed attacked every connection behind that sector. Once those connections failed, the fortress began destroying itself. Demolitions reduced options. Conflicting reports delayed decisions. Fear of encirclement prevented concentration. The surrender transformed those failures into a measurable disaster. Tens of thousands entered captivity. Weapons, transport, and supplies strengthened the Axis pursuit, yet the aftermath supplied a final warning. Captured resources carried Rommel toward El Alamein. They could not repair the logistical system supporting him across the Mediterranean and North Africa. His advance stopped after the temporary windfall was consumed. 5 months later, the British Eighth Army returned to Tobruk during the Axis retreat. The fortress changed hands without repeating the catastrophe of June. That later reversal did not erase the prisoners or the political shock. Clarified what Tobruk had always been. Its value depended upon the army, navy, air power, logistics, and decisions surrounding it. The fall was neither an inexplicable collapse nor proof that the defenders refused to fight. It was the final expression of a campaign already disintegrating. Gazala weakened the army, isolation changed the mission, and delay destroyed the remaining options. Klopper signed the surrender because the system placed the last decision in his hands. The system itself had been failing for weeks by the time German tanks reached the harbor. That chain could no longer be reversed. Tobruk fell in one day because its defenses had not begun collapsing that morning. They had been losing coherence long before the first aircraft appeared over the southeastern perimeter.